So, hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar on email archives, jointly hosted by CAUL and NSLA. My name's Peter Green and I'm the chair for today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which Curtin University's Perth campus is located, and from where I'm speaking today, which is the Wadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I'd also acknowledge those colleagues who are in Melbourne, and if you're joining us, presumably joining us from home today. We have 3 presentations followed by time for questions to the presenters and discussion. And then after that, consideration of establishing a community of practice for email archives. We will be using breakout rooms, so don't be alarmed, and I'll explain when we get there. And some housekeeping before we begin. So we have over 120 registrations for the session today and interest from others not able to join us. We are recording the webinar for later sharing. Request that you stay on mute for the presentations. In the chat, you'll find a link to a shared Google Doc. Because we've got such a large group today, we will try and use that for questions and comments. You can put questions and comments and whatever into the Google Doc at any time, but we won't pause for questions and discussion until after the 3rd presentation. We will be using breakout rooms after the presentations before returning to the main forum. That's just to check that you're awake. I will try and open the floor for comments as well as for questions. So when we get to that part, if you raise your hand, I will invite you to speak. And of course, just bear with us as the whole thing might get a bit messy, but I'm sure that will be fun. Excuse me while I work out how to stop sharing. Here we go. So I'd like to welcome our first speakers today. Flora Feltham, her digital archivist, and Rhonda Grantham, acting legal deposit librarian from the National Library of New Zealand, to talk to us today. And you can start sharing your screens, please, on collecting COVID-19 email ephemera.
All right, can you guys see my slide?
We can.
Cool. Thank you for that introduction, Peter. Kia ora tātou, no mai haere mai ki tēnei hui. Ko Flora Feltham, tōku ingoa, hea kaimahi ahau no te puna mātauranga o Aotearoa, te kaipupuri puranga ma te hiko ahau, tēnā koutou. Kia ora, good morning everybody. My name is Flora Feltham and I am a digital archivist at the National Library of New Zealand, and I'm very excited to be here today with my colleague Rhonda to talk to you about some of the COVID-19 email ephemera collecting that we've been doing for about the last year at the National Library, in fact over a year now. I'm going to give you a bit of background to the project, discuss some of our general considerations, and then I'm going to talk to you specifically about one technical challenge that has been preoccupying me. And then Rhonda is going to go into a really deep dive, very technical dive on one strand of our collecting workflows. So you're going to get kind of, it's a presentation of 2 halves. So I'll talk for 10 minutes and then Rhonda for 10 minutes. Okay, hold on a second. Did my slide, everyone see that? Cool. So as you will all know, the National Library of New Zealand is responsible for collecting the documentary heritage of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that includes, since the beginning of last year, documenting New Zealanders' experiences of COVID-19. The email ephemera project that we're talking to you about today is actually just one tiny strand of a much larger rapid response collecting program that kicked off just as New Zealand's alert levels were starting to rise in March 2020. I don't really have the time here to go into the kind of wider context of the rest of that project, except to say that our COVID-19 collecting included emails, it collected online publications, social media, memes, websites. So it's a huge piece of work, and this is just one small part of that. And the other thing I wanted to say about the kind of rapid response collecting is that when we started this work, it was really important to us that it responded ethically to the circumstances under which we were working. So it all had to be collecting work that we could do entirely from home. It had to be a project that was adaptable to very changeable circumstances. And it had to be appropriate and respectful to the context that we were in. So staff wellbeing was the top priority. And also it was collecting work we wanted to do without putting pressure on or overwhelming an already stretched public going into an alert level 4 lockdown. So that's some of that wider context. But why did we decide to include emails in that? So when we started going into lockdown, I'm sure all of you noticed that you got emails from your gym, your internet provider, your yoga studio, every community group that you belong to, that articulated how they were responding to the pandemic and the alert level changes. And for us, that as a collecting institution, kind of indicated that future historians would be able to look at this material and answer questions like, what did social distancing look like in practice? How did people socialize online? How did they consume culture? How did they learn? How did every single service pivot to being an online service? So we decided that was really important. And we had two methods of collecting emails, which you're going to hear more about. But one of them, which Rhonda will be unpacking for you in depth, is emails that were kind of incidentally collected via the electronic legal deposit email inbox. And the collecting stream that I was in charge of, which was emails donated by National Library staff members from their personal email addresses. So, and we collected for nearly a year, and that allowed us to collect emails that covered the National Library, cover the national lockdown, and then changing alert levels as the year went on. So when Auckland went to a level 3 lockdown and so on. And this is just an example of some of the emails that these are just examples of emails that we collected and articulate, I guess, some of the technical challenges of collecting this material. So you can see that we have, emails are kind of infinite scroll. They're very long objects, which doesn't necessarily fit easily with how we might interact with them. There is personally identifiable information. So you can see in this email from Genesis, it's got my name, and it's got my customer number, and this one in the middle, you can see there that it's got dynamic content. So there was a clock in there that counted down to an online event, which now sits at 0 permanently. So there's some kind of interesting stuff there. And I'm going to go into the technical issues with the personal information just in a little bit. So, come on. Here we go. So when we first started this project, we consulted pretty widely around the National Library, and we came up with kind of requirements or kind of approaches that we needed to think about as we went into it. And the most immediate thing we wanted to think about was collecting what we can with the tools that we have. And what we have ended up with a year later is 19 inbox files, which are collections of emails exported from personal email addresses, in this case, usually Gmail. We have 1,430 individual messages, which is the legal deposit emails and individual messages that some people forwarded to us. And we have 5 PST files, which are collections of emails from personal email addresses, in this case, Outlook. I actually don't know how many individual messages we actually have across all of those, but I'm going to take a wild reckon and say that it's about 4,000, maybe more, but I'm not actually sure at this point. The short-term preservation needs for this collection were to make it available to researchers as as soon as possible, but to do so in a way where the security and privacy risks were mitigated. And this comes back to something which I'll talk about on the next slide, which is the making sure that people can access the material, they can do research with it, but the people who donated emails, their information is in no way compromised. And I'll show you some of the ways that where we found that information coming up. And the long-term preservation was essentially, we need to keep these things forever. So the National Library legislation says that we preserve material in perpetuity, which is forever. And to those ends, we knew that we didn't know how people will use these collections in the future. So we wanted to make sure that we, I guess, kept our options as open as possible. So if people wanted to use them as a data set, they could. If people wanted to look at individual messages, they could. And we don't know what tools people are going to be using in the future. So we want to leave these emails essentially in the most native format possible to preserve all future uses. And that means minimal intervention. So those short-term and long-term preservation needs are kind of interestingly counter to each other in a way that I find quite fascinating. So there's a lot going on with this collection, but I'm just going to focus on one technical issue, which is the personally identifiable information. So there is just some examples you can see on the screen of the kinds of information that you get. So where is it? Okay, so in the email header, so we found that personal information was in the subject line. It was in the sender field, so you had email addresses in there. It was in the reply to field, and it was in the recipients field, and that's going to mostly be people's email addresses and personal names. And because you might get an email which says hello Flora or something like that, even in the subject line. So that one kind of surprised me. In the body of the email, it's actually kind of way more wild. So you get the same instances of email addresses and personal names, but you also get membership numbers, reward balances, and my personal favorite is the outgoing links, which actually take you to, which might say just something innocuous like, manage your preferences or click here to unsubscribe, and it will take you to often a sort of a MailChimp landing page in a browser which has somebody's email address or their personal name. The one right at the bottom there is a snapshot from being able to click through an email somebody donated from Lotto, and it takes you to a landing page where you can manage things like passwords and email settings and that person's Lotto account. So to me, what this speaks to is the huge importance of providing access copies which have this kind of native functionality completely nuked, essentially, that people actually can't follow the outgoing links because we can't essentially manage what happens in an email browser outside the email. And heaven forbid somebody unsubscribe to your Jim's newsletter on your behalf. So the approach that we've taken with this information has been kind of exploratory. So there's been two of us working on this mainly. A piece of work, for example, that I've done is I put a portion of the collection in EPAD to see what kind of redaction we could do there. I also did a piece of work to just manually comb through all of the emails to come up with lists of strings that are associated with personally identifiable information, by which I mean finding all of the sentences which direct you to like outgoing links for unsubscription. So things like, you can update your preferences, unsubscribe for more future emails, kind of finding those things. But the one that I think has been the most exciting from my perspective is our digital preservation analyst, Jay Gattuso, did a proof of concept using a Python script that picks up an individual email message and builds a new email object according to privacy parameters that we set. So what this means is you can remove personal information from headers fairly simply by telling the script to, take the value in the sender field and in the new email object, like populate it with null values. So with the structured information, it's actually quite straightforward to remove the personal information. It gets quite a lot harder within the body of the email, and lots of the things that Jay and I have talked about are, you can get the script to say, for example, locate the email address in the structured information and then remove it from the body of the email every time it finds it. Things get even more complicated when we're dealing with numbers, not so much like credit card numbers and phone numbers, because you can use regex to identify certain patterns of numbers. One thing that Jay has suggested is that what we do is we get the script to essentially brute force remove all of the structured information, but return back to a human every time an email comes up with something that isn't in the dictionary, i.e. numbers. So we're still moving forwards with that, but we haven't done it to the entire collection. I'm going to talk a bit about the end, what the next steps are. But I think in the case of the redaction, it's going to be kind of at least a two-step process whereby a bunch of it is automated, and then a whole bunch of emails come to a human to double check. And I think that's everything I specifically had to say. I'm going to pop back at the end, but in the meantime, I'm going to pass you to Rhonda.
Hi, I'm Rhonda. I am the acting legal deposit librarian at the National Library of New Zealand, Flora's colleague. The legal deposit team's collecting of emails was part of the phase 1 rapid response collecting of ephemeral material. And again, so we're just collecting, things like we are a really weird community member that just gets like heaps and heaps and heaps of emails. So the National Library receives a huge variety of emails and notifications from publishers, government agencies, groups, and businesses. And lots of events were being cancelled. All sorts of really caring messages were being sent to us, and we were receiving them. So many of these we were collecting as publications under the legal deposit mandate. So, for example, we'd receive a MailChimp newsletter, go to where it is hosted online, and use web harvesting tools to capture the content. Some of these messages, notifications, emails were too ephemeral and fell outside the scope of our collecting. But we recognise the heritage value of these notifications with COVID-19 content during the lockdown. We assessed and filtered emails into designated email folders from February 2020 to February 2021. So we got this amazing breadth of email content over that time. Where's my, yes. So let's get down to brass tacks of how we did it. We were going to collect material from 2 email boxes. Several team members work from the shared mailboxes, and we work in a lockdown corporate environment. So the ability to export data files .pst is disabled by default for both our personal and shared email boxes. We receive a huge volume of email into these boxes. So we're sort of running at about, anywhere from 200 to 300 unread emails. And we use notifications in different ways. For example, we might need to hold on to an email for a few days or a month because we are working through the contents of the email to collect publications. So we're using it like as a scoping tool. And because there was a few people would be assessing and collecting the emails, we needed a simple, consistent process. And because we needed to be adding emails to the folders at different points in time, we needed a flexible process. So the choice was specific COVID-19 folders in our emails cabinets, and for ease of use, we made them favorites in our Outlook inboxes. So next slide. Once every few months during the collecting phase, I would begin processing these amazing emails. So I would, to create a boundary around the set I wanted to work on, I moved them into a new folder completely in Outlook. Our team categorizes emails with their names if they're working on them, or adds other categorizations. I stripped all these out, and to normalize a set, I marked them all as unread. So I then, once I'd done all these tasks, I pulled the emails into a folder into some backed up secure storage. And early on, I realized in the file properties that they did not match with the date the email was received. So to capture this and to enable the flexibility of moving and copy, I wanted to collect the date of the email in a useful way. So during the COVID-19 response period, we were very fortunate to have the aforementioned Jay Gattuso seconded to our section. I explained what I wanted to capture: the date and time the email was received. And so this would help with sorting, processing, and deduplicating emails, because we were taking emails from 2 different inboxes. Jay wrote a script using the Python module extract.msg to extract information from the email and pass it. Date and time were then appended to the email file name. Between that and the file name was a delimiter, so we could reverse this process if required. The script also made month folders and moved the emails into them, and created a log with original file name, new file name, and the file's MD5, which I use this log for checking and deduping. I did receive some errors when I was processing, which was because of file paths being too long, because sometimes emails have really long file names, and they also have little images and all sorts of other cool stuff. So anyway, this is the renamed files in their month buckets. So that's May 2020. And the script itself handled the images and the special characters in the file names. And this is a sort of summary of what happened. So we collected 1,420 emails using this method by our team. And they were sent between February 2020 and February 2021. And as you can see, the majority were sent during the lockdown, with spikes in August 2020 and February 2021, which coincide with changes to the alert levels for the rest of the country and lockdowns in Auckland. Yeah, so that's what happened. I'll pass it back to our Flora.
So that was a look at, kind of an in-depth look at one of the collecting processes. And so we have wrapped up our collecting stage now. So we have obviously a bunch more steps and questions to answer. And for me, the first one is that redaction step about getting rid of the personally identifiable information. But the next one is the thinking about the access copies. For us at the moment, we're thinking that PDF access copies are going to be the most useful and pragmatic in terms of being easy for people to access via the NDHA viewer that we use, and also making sure that they kind of minimize the risks associated with the personally identifiable information. So like, not being able to access those outgoing links through a PDF. The process of how we create those access copies is still something we're exploring, but it does look like that is something we could possibly kind of plug into the existing script for doing the redactions as well. And then that would give us a chance to also do a kind of validation process where we check that the emails are similar enough to the original. So that's like check that we have only removed the right information and haven't completely kind of bungled these objects. And then the last step is obviously description, which is creating the catalogue records for this collection. And that will be pretty straightforward. We'll have a collection level record, and then we will have different series for the different kind of threads of collecting. So the legal deposit emails, and then the ones that were donated by staff. So that was a very, very whistle-stop tour through this project. But yeah, Rhonda and I will both be around to answer any further questions you have throughout the day. So that's everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Flora and Rhonda, that was terrific. You'll just have to imagine the applause coming from the floor, which there would be lots of. But we'll move on. Just remind people, I've put a link into the chat for a Google Doc, and you can feel free to have a look at that and to write your questions, capture those thoughts before they get overwhelmed by our next speaker, which is Matt Burgess, Digital Collections Analyst, who's going to now share his slides and talk to us about collecting emails, challenges and complexities. And I'm sure in the 20 minutes he's got, we'll only just touch the surface of a very big mountain. So I'll hand over to you, Matt.
Thank you. Just sharing my screen now.
That's good. Good to go.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew Burgess, a digital collections analyst at the State Library of New South Wales. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work. So I'm going to provide kind of a bit more of a general overview on the challenges and complexities we're facing at the State Library. So emails are an important component of contemporary collecting. They can provide a measure of diligence, organization, and collaboration from the owner. Their content might be organizational, thanking, acknowledging, requesting, enclosing, or a means to contact individuals or organizations as part of a process. So at the State Library, a lack of defined workflow for preservation and access does not impact our decisions for acquisition. So we're already receiving collections with email components despite not having a defined workflow for the entire process. We've recently received a collection that contains over 11,000 emails that will be used for development of our workflows going forward. Highlighting the potential future workflow options is a way that I try to encourage our staff to acquire these collections, because if we don't get it now, then we might not potentially get it in the future. And it's a bit of a challenge with multiple solutions in development or research at the moment, but nothing built in with our existing system architecture. So a few things that I've come across in the last few years is the review, appraisal, and triage of mail, or the RADM project, which looks at entity recognition using natural language processing and converting PST to MBOX. There's also EPAD, which I'm sure will get more mentioned today. And also last year, there was a release of archiving email using PDF from the Task Force on Technical Approaches for Email Archives. So when it comes to acquisition, we're currently providing instructions to the collection owner, and this will differ based on the software or the email provider that they're working. But it does beg the question of how much work can you put on the owner of the collection in terms of selection. Our general rule is to ask them to create a folder or a tag in whatever they're using of selected emails for export, and where possible to try and include both the sent and received emails. And this is obviously impacted by the owner's computer literacy. So is it reasonable to get them to use the EPAD appraisal module to produce an MBOX file, or do we have to help them out in that area? Acquiring a copy of the owner is also a challenge in terms of the file formats will differ based on the provider and the software. But there's also technical limitations of the owner's computer for export. So the example I mentioned before with those 11,000 emails, I actually went to the donor's house to try and export them, but their computer was so slow, I just couldn't export them really. So I had to look at a workaround by copying the entire mailbox from their computer and then extracting that selected email back on site. We have a standard process at the library for our born digital collections to bag them on the network. So I say bag, that's using the Bagot file packaging format. So this is our pre-ingest network storage before we put things into our digital preservation system. So all material requires valuation for inclusion in the collections at the library, and this includes digital material. And regardless of whether it's a donation offered under the Cultural Gifts Program or purchased. So discussions are currently happening internally and within NSLA libraries on how to value digital material. But how do you value an email? Do you do it by size? What about duplication? For example, that collection I mentioned earlier, I put that through EPAD and identified 2.5 gigabytes of duplicate attachments and 17 duplicate emails. If you go by the content, you could look at the number of emails, both sent and received over a specific period of time, and a list of correspondence and the number of emails to and from each. How should we be looking at generating this summary? What information is important? It's relatively easy to extract some of this information using EPAD if working with an mbox file format. Obviously, valuation requires access to the collection for that determination. So how do we do that? Should we be utilizing the original software that it was created in for browsing? Should we use Forensic Toolkit, which we also have at the library, or should we be using EPAD? And then the other question is, do we need to provide instructions or training to valuers on how to look at this material as well? Flora mentioned the issues with sensitivity, and I spoke about the types of personally identifiable information contained in emails at an Australasia Preserves meetup last year on COVID-19 collecting. So I'm not going to go into detail on that here, but there's a lot of it, and it is a big privacy concern, even when the content of the email doesn't necessarily relate to the receiver. So as Flora was demonstrating, this information is not necessarily just in the body of the text. The content of the email itself may also be sensitive. So for example, the creator might be discussing health concerns that they might not necessarily want public. The ability to identify and redact personally identifiable information is impacted by the file format. But identification is not as much as a challenge as redaction is. And Flora kind of mentioned some of the challenges there as well. So in terms of processing our email collections, we've got to consider how specifically for emails we should be processing them for preservation and access. So do we need to convert PST, so Microsoft proprietary mailboxes to mbox? Should we be extracting individual emails into PDF or EML format? Do we need to do some sort of analysis in EPAD for archival description? Can we process the emails in a PDF format in the same way? So you can't actually import PDFs into EPAD, they need to be in the mbox format. And we also need to consider what information should be stored in the catalog versus the preservation system. So in terms of preservation, our collection preservation policy determines the preservation of the original file regardless of the format. So we might create a normalized copy. So I've mentioned PST to mbox there, but we'll still retain the original as well. So it means we can always go back to that original if we need to. So there is the consideration of migration to mbox for preservation and access where appropriate with EPAD. And at the library, we do have established workflows for ingestion and preservation for other file formats, but it's untested with emails at this point. But because we do have a digital preservation system, that bit level preservation is not as much of a challenge. It's more around the processing of those files and how we can provide access to them. So we can provide access on an ad hoc basis as we have evaluation, but we need to think about more automated ways to do this in the future. So we currently have plans for a dedicated restricted computer for accessing digital collections in our reading room, where we could possibly look at utilizing EPAD. But this computer is for all restricted digital collections, which includes digitized. So We need to consider whether we need separate computers based on the software requirements, or maybe looking at virtual machines or emulation based on each specific scenario for access to a collection. There's a question on whether we can provide access online with integrated viewers as part of our collection experience program. So this program is a new catalogue to enable readers to search and browse the library's collections more easily, intuitively and enjoyably, with an improved search experience and digital collections interface. So it's not easy to just put an mBox in an embedded viewer within this program of work. We might have to look at something else possibly, which is a challenge for all complex born digital collections. But I guess the big question is how researchers want to engage with emails. Do they want to look at it in that original computer environment? Do they want to do that in-depth analysis with EPAD or FTK? I was really fortunate to visit the British Library in 2019, and they were doing a session where they invited researchers into the library, highlighted their born digital collections, and then ask them how they would like to access it. So I think there's an opportunity here for us to engage with researchers to provide usable access options in the future. And I've got some references and further readings there. I've probably gone through this really quickly, but that's me.
Thank you very much, Matt. That's terrific. And it's a lot of food for thought in that presentation. And Amy also shared some things in the chat, and I've put those into the Google Doc of previous presentations. I'd now like to invite our third speakers, Simone Barnes, librarian, and Michelle Collier, liaison librarian at the State Library of Western Australia, who are going to talk to us about pre-implementation planning of EPAD at the State Library of Western Australia, crawling before walking. So I invite you to share your screen now.
Good morning. We are speaking from the traditional lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nations. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We particularly like to thank Peter, Green and Larissa for the opportunity to participate in this webinar on EPAD, as we see the role of electronic email as an important format, enriching our heritage collections and providing the research community within Western Australia with access to born digital archives of individuals and organisations. We're still in the planning stages and do not have all the answers. Perhaps we are moving towards creeping before crawling with our learnings on EPADs within collection services. As we are all aware, email is a very significant digital format, with Mr. Ray Tomlinson credited in sending the first email across a network with the ampersand separating the name of the user and the user's machine. This predates the birth of the World Wide Web by many years. We know that email is a bundle of data running on a network, routed through an email server, received by an email client with codified structure laid out in RFC 5233, the Internet Message Format, with the addressing standard defined in RFC 5321, Simple Mail Transport Protocol.
So our introduction to EPAD came through the CAUL webinar in early 2020. There we go. With Mr. Peter Chan, who is a digital archivist from Stanford University and EPAD project manager, presenting at the National Library of New Zealand's Archiving Email Symposium. And we were very inspired that this might provide us with a solution to some of the challenges of acquiring and providing researchers with access to email archives within our Leah Jane Cohen Reading Room, which is a service we don't currently offer. We are still in the infancy of dealing with digital archives at the State Library. So we figured that this would be a good case study, especially seeing as COVID-19 led to an increase in donations of email material from various people within the community. And we joined with our international colleagues in the GLAM sector, documenting the unfolding and evolving pandemic. And we contributed to the NSLA Collecting COVID-19 report submitted to the NSLA Heads of Collections in late 2020. So currently, when we receive an email, what we are doing is normalizing it to a PDF or Word document and uploading it using our reformatting software, which is internally known as SLRP, which is the State Library's Limber and Useful Reformatting Application, which is an open source software application that allows rapid and simple ingest of metadata and digital objects. It was built in-house as a result of the Ignite Digital Refresh project and has been designed to interface automatically and seamlessly with our library management system, which is Sierra. It automatically creates derivatives for access copies and, where possible, creates archival derivatives, but currently does not support the ingest of born digital file formats for email, such as MBOX, EML, MSG or PST files, nor the relatedness of the entire mailbox. As I say, our current process is to convert emails to Word or PDF and upload them individually. And you can see an example on the slide there of how we've dealt with emails in the past. Donors supply their emails to us by printing them individually also to hard copy, and sometimes we get documents copied and pasted into PDF, Word documents, etc. We don't request our donor to redact personal identifying information in their emails, so we quite often receive emails that have medical, financial, personal, professional information, and we tend to process these files as archival objects with no access provided to mitigate the risks of exposing people's personal information. We list emails in our manuscript note listings, which are attached as PDF files to the catalogue records, and they're not particularly searchable within our LMS. We can't, unless it's mentioned somewhere within the catalogue record, there's no way that we can search for emails as a particular class of material, and it's not consistent across collections at this point. Our finding aids or our manuscript notes are available, are searchable through Google, but not through our catalogue currently. So as I say, we are in the infancy of dealing with digital collections, and we are looking at how we bring things in. Currently, we offer a donor kit and collection offer form, which donors fill out to complete a list of their collection, and we don't really provide guidance to donors on the email system used to create the document, which we need to really rethink. We also have an online collections offer form. The NSLA Digital Acquisitions Guidelines and Checklists for Working with Donors 2019 draws upon the AIMS Digital Materials Survey for Personal Digital Archives and provides some guidance in conversation with donors to clarify more information about their emails, such as multiple accounts, what services they use, how their emails are organised, how it's saved, are they managing their digital and paper correspondence together or separately, questions about address books and space quotas.
Thank you, Simone. What we would like to do with email and how we would like to use EPAD. EPAD, as we know, developed and maintained by Stanford University offers institutions 4 modules for the appraisal, ingest, processing, discovery and delivery of email archives. We particularly felt that the appraisal module offered a lot of flexibility for creators, curators and archivists to load, review and manage an email archive on a local server prior to accessioning to a repository. We're particularly also interested in the functionality of the processing module offered staff, particularly the interface with a number of authority services, including OCLC FAST for the selection of LC subject headings, DPpedia, a project which extracts structured information from Wikipedia, expressed as open knowledge graphs. So this will associate an image within an email with a link. The Virtual International Authority file from OCLC, that's VIAF, and the Library of Congress Name Authority file, LCNAF. We really were impressed with these and felt that this offered greater metadata description and access for potential email archives into the future. The Discovery module offering a web-based environment to access redacted email and delivery, the separate module providing moderated full text access to unrestricted email archives hosted on a web server managed in a terminal within a reading room. So we're not there yet, we had to start thinking again.
So as part of this, we've done a whole lot of reading. We've been reading about the future of email archives, digital preservation handbook, preserving email, task force on technical approaches for email archives, and an old hand digital You've Got Mail. And probably a lot more that we haven't really taken note of. And we've started a deeper think about the things that we need to consider before implementing EPAD, including how it's going to affect our collecting policy framework, including our donor kit, impact on our collections committee, statement of significance, deed of gift, and the staff skills that we need to successfully archive emails. And we've been in conversation with our IT department at the library and the broader Department of Local Government, Sport and Cultural Industries to try and work through the challenges presented by EPAD, including our network infrastructure for third-party email software and IMAP protocols. And we're also looking at the guidance that we need to provide donors about providing us with their emails. So far, we're not being inundated with floods of email donations, but obviously it's going to be, like most correspondence would be taking place over email for businesses and organisations. And as that's a focus for our collecting, we probably need to be prepared for how we're going to deal with it when we do start getting our floods of email donations.
We have our policy framework, developing our collections, the collection development policy framework, circa 2009 with corrections in 2013. This is currently being reviewed with stakeholder consultation process, including surveys. This will inform our future aspirations in moving forward with collecting digital content, with the future possibility of the completeness of electronic mail present with the elements of the email saved, including attachments, the to, from, and fields, etc. Our strategic plan, which is dated 2018 to 2022, where we articulate the objective to expand our digital reach, capability collections and services to the level of our capabilities with traditional collections, and actively liaise with significant donors to acquire born digital archives, underpins our collecting hopes and aspirations for the future moving forward with email. There are additional issues that we need to consider, including writing the significance assessment, which is submitted to our collections committee for potential donations that exceed 100 gigabytes, the deed of gift schedule detailing the items donated, and the rewriting of the donor kit with more guidance to donors on areas including the technical, copyright and personal identifying information found in emails. We also have the additional issue at present, Parliament has yet not passed the legal deposit regulations for digital content. We are still upskilling our staff and workflows to deal with digital objects. through the creation of a pre-ingest processing for digital preservation working group within the library, and several staff have actively engaged with the DPC, the Digital Preservation Coalition, online digital skills training, novice to know-how, and providing access to digital content. Our current staffing working within private archives collections is at 1.8 full-time equivalent. Have a number of issues with IT and infrastructure. Currently, we do not have Archivematica as a digital repository platform or Preservica as a trusted digital repository system to maintain the long-term access to digital objects. As everyone's aware, version 7 and above of EPAD integrates with Archivematica, which is Open Archive Information System compliant. Currently, a broader organisation approach to this long-term issue is being framed for discussion within the library, as we acknowledge that slow, our lingering use for reformatting system is in its sunset years. In conversations with IT, we are clarifying a range of issues, including the current firewall settings, range of ports needed to be opened, including 8080, 403, secure LMAT 993 or 143 is a non-encrypted port. Further consideration of our desktop environment for iPad, as EPAD requires 64 RAM and our C drive is currently offering us 8. We have been successful in updating to Java 1.8. The issue of third-party migration software is still under discussion, as Email Chemy is a cost service or Mailstorm is a free service. These are required to convert PST files into standard inbox format for ingest into the iPad appraisal module. There's also the issue of the requirement for space on a web server to run a separate delivery module to provide access to the full text corpus of the collection, future collection, I should clarify, within the Leah Jane Code reading room. It's another talking point.
So our heritage collections would not exist without the kindness and generosity of our donors. We currently have 2 collections that we are working towards as a proof of concept for the implementation of EPAD at the State Library. Stages WA and the Offshore Angling Club of WA Inc., each containing several hundred emails forming a large component of the collection. As emails are unable to be exported in their native file format, requiring third-party tools to convert. This may prove challenging to our donors, many of whom are elderly and work in a voluntary capacity with associations and organisations. Popular email systems such as Outlook use PST files, Gmail using Mbox via Google Takeout. So we need to progress our knowledge, providing clarity regarding email system and file formats and conversion tools. And included in this is the configuration of IMAP protocol within donor email accounts, consideration of issues such as viruses, malware, attachments, video formats, and other common email issues that may be difficult to manage within an EDRMS environment. We also have to consider things such as copyright and privacy. A lot of our donors are donating on behalf of organisations, and so there might be emails from hundreds of people, and all of whom would have maintained copyright over their own email content. And so we would have to consider a risk management approach towards making them available to the public, which is our attention aim.
We've installed EPAD on a number of desktops and have run a number of tests attempting to import a Gmail account using IMAP with varied success. We are in active discussions with our supportive colleagues in IT, and we are super optimistic of imminent progress and success. This is our first error message we generated.
And so this is the Leah Jane Code reading room, which is where we would like to end up with a terminal in the reading room being used to provide access to significant collections of email archives. As I said before, we are still in our infancy learning about EPAD and learning about digital collections, and we're we probably haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what we need to consider. As you can see, we are still very much at the beginning, and this is just a list of things that institutions will need to consider with regards to implementing email archiving. We are eager to collaborate with other institutions to form a community of practice for email archiving, as we're committed to improve how the community discovers, uses and shares our collections, and to expanding our digital reach, capability collections and services to the level of our capabilities with traditional collections. So we're cautiously optimistic that we'll slowly progress the potential offered by EPAD for email archives, and eventually, hopefully, we will have as large a collection of email as we do traditional written correspondence.
As we know, email is a significant digital format in which we all create correspondence, documenting our personal and professional journeys through life. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simone and Michelle. Again, you just need to imagine the polite applause that you're getting from the room at this stage, particularly for sharing where you're at in that very early stage of working through building that substantial collection. So before we go into the panel discussion, I'm going to ask Larissa in a moment to put you into breakout rooms. I'm just going to share a slide. Which I've got. So just pretend that you're all sitting at round tables in a large conference room, as I'm sure many of you have done over the years, and that I've just asked you to talk with other people at your table. What did you find interesting or useful from the presentations, and what would you like to discuss further? And to do that, we're going to put you into breakout rooms, which will be randomly assigned. So you can put your questions and comments into the Google Doc. Remind you that the link is in the chat. I see quite a few of you have joined there. You're all being very polite about putting anything in. I've seeded the document with some of the challenges that you identified when you registered. If you remember, at registration, you're asked what were your current challenges, and I've pulled out some of those into the document as well. And also during the presentation, Matt and others have put some more content in from their presentations, which has been great. So it would be good if you turn your cameras on and unmute yourself. You'll be automatically assigned to a breakout room. Will be about 5 minutes. I'm leaving that to Larissa to decide what 5 minutes actually means in real time. So you don't need to have one person speak on your behalf, but it might be useful to have one person write anything into the Google Doc to bring back to the main session. And you'll get a pop-up notification letting you know that the break-in room will be closing, and then you'll be automatically returned to the main session. Don't think I've forgotten anything there, Larissa, except just to tell you, trap for new players, don't spend your whole 5 minutes introducing yourselves to each other in the group. Might be nice to say who you are, but then get on to actually talking about the content. I'll see some of you in a breakout room, and the rest of you I'll see back in the main session in a little while. Thanks, Larissa. Larissa, are we all back from the breakout rooms now? Yes, okay, thank you. And I can see our speakers on the screen, so that's great. I'm just going to have a look and see what we've got in the Google Doc. Okay, so let me just throw in some questions, and people might have some other things. So Flora and Rondo, I've got a question here from me actually, but around the Python scripts that you've been developing and whether you're planning to make those available to share with other places who might be interested.
Yeah, I can take that, Peter. Of course, I will just want to check with the person that actually developed the script and probably put them up on some kind of Git repository that people can just download them from. Yeah. So yes, definitely. Yeah.
And the one that deals with redacting is definitely not ready to share because it's so drafty, I guess. And that piece of work probably won't be completed for a while because I'm working really part-time at the moment. But once I pick that up again, kind of more fulsomely when I'm back full-time in December, then we can probably share that one as well. But that wouldn't be for a while.
And I suspect people won't be in a condition to have collections where they can use those scripts, but I think it would be useful to take advantage of the work that's already been done. And another question for you just around the ephemera email collection. So under what conditions would people be able to access that? So is that a thing that people will need to come in to the library and into the library in some way to view, or would you make those available online, or how are you thinking about that?
Great question. Short answer, don't know. Long answer is, so I guess the obvious ways that people access digital content at the National Library is either everything which is open access online, or they have to come into the library to access something which can only be accessed in the reading room. My sense is that it will depend on how we make those access copies. So if we end up using something like EPAD, then that's going to have to be in the reading room. And if we do the PDFs, maybe that could be online, but for privacy reasons, it probably will still be the reading room. So my sense is that people will come into the reading room and they'll be looking at it on a secure laptop that we have there, but that's still something which we're figuring out.
There's a bit of irony that we're dealing with born digital collections. We're working with them, and then people will have to physically come into a secure location to access them.
Yeah.
But that does seem to be what's probably going to be the case, indeed. And this is for any of the panel members. So Simone and Michelle, I'm not sure if you've got your camera on. I can't see you. There you go. Thank you. And maybe Matt might have something to say about this. But it seems to me from what you've all said that you can't wait to develop your workflows and to understand your technologies, that you have to actually jump in with effectively live collections and work it out on the go. And I just wondered if you wanted to make some more comments around that. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, so I mean, that's an attitude I kind of take with all our collections. There's been hesitancy in the past at the library to collect formats that people haven't either worked with before or aren't comfortable with because we don't have a clearly defined workflow. But the reality is, if you don't collect it now, then there's that risk that you'll never be able to collect it. So whether it's an issue with the person or the technology or the corruption of the files themselves. So I mentioned that our new collection preservation policy, which I should add includes both physical and digital preservation, mentions that we retain the original for born digital. So it doesn't matter what we get in, we're keeping that, and then we can work out the rest of the process along the way. And, you know, I think it's more critical to get the content than to worry about providing access to it, because whether that happens in 10, 20, 30, 100 years, you can't provide access to it if you don't have it.
Yes, and I think that's often been the case, hasn't it, with archival collections. Others wanted to comment on that. I did have some comments in the breakout room, Flora, that you seem so much further down the road than most of us. Do you feel that way?
No, just no, we're all like, you know, doing the best we can with what we've got and the collections we have to work with. One thing I will say is I have just noticed in the chat that somebody has asked about the email archives being available via our virtual reading room, which I totally forgot about. And yes, we actually do have a virtual reading room service that we could provide reading room only material in. So even if people come to their reading room, they don't need to actually do so by coming into the building, which I totally forgot to add.
Did you do a presentation on that sometime on the virtual reading room?
I didn't, but several of my colleagues did. Yeah.
So is that available?
Don't know. We can share with
Might
people.
be a future presentation in the pipeline there.
Yeah, but yeah. So no, I don't think we're. But going back to the original question, I don't think we're necessarily more further along. I think you just kind of chip away at the problems that you have in front of you, and yeah.
I think that COVID-19 kind of forced us into some rapid response collecting that we might not have actually done if we'd had time to be more intentional about it. We just cracked on because we had to. So I'd like to take that attitude to some more of our work.
And there's a huge team of people who are working on it as well. It's not just me and Rhonda.
Yeah, lots of people.
Michelle or Simone, did you have a comment on that?
So, yeah, I think that definitely COVID has made this more of a priority. It was something that we were already interested in, but it's definitely something that we need to be more aware of now that we could go into lockdown at any point in time. And I think that we are definitely lagging behind other institutions, but we're trying to catch up, and it's just great to be able to see what other people are doing and not have to reinvent the wheel all the time.
We're particularly keen to learn from other institutions in their approach to appraisal. We're particularly mindful of the amount of content that we're missing out on collecting because of our digital infrastructure with the system that we use and not having Preservica at the moment. So that's the thing that we're just very aware that we don't want to be in a situation where we have a period of history where we don't have adequate representation of the content and materials created in that time. And email is not a new format. It's sort of, I don't know how everyone else feels. I feel like it's been around forever. It's ever present and you can't escape it. So I'm surprised that we don't have more researchers asking us questions about email as a primary historic source for discovery and exploration.
I have a question, if I'm not sure I entirely understand the context, but it says, is there a difference between archival and published emails? And I think that's in relation to legal deposit.
So yes, the ephemera collection is interesting because it is basically published items. Historically, ephemeral material has been out of scope of legal deposit in the print world. So when we move to more digital content, we sort of have kind of kept that same division going because there is an ongoing ephemera collection. for print material. So it seems wise to just continue that on for now. But yeah, we receive many emails, and they have the sort of, we think of them as publications. So we collect them. So under the legal deposit mandate. So is that what you're kind of asking?
I think that is probably what the question's asking.
Yeah, yeah.
But
So it's
I
a sort
guess
of a selection decision between the two of them.
all email is not equal, clearly.
No, I mean, and we do have quite a few email collections that I guess would be considered kind of archival in the sense that they come in manuscript collections, and they're people's personal correspondence and things like that, and they get treated in much the same way as existing correspondence. So something that we were kind of talking about in the breakout room is that how this is kind of the specifically email ephemera is kind of a funny little collection, because it's this kind of straddles this slightly weird zone between published but also kind of appearing in somebody's personal email inbox.
So just looking at what else questions. So excuse me. I'm interested to know whether you're thinking that you'll be taking email collections that may be embargoed. These are maybe personal donations. I don't know if we have anyone on here from University of Melbourne who've taken the Germaine Greer collection, but it is often the case that personal archives are embargoed, and that you might be taking email collections that could be embargoed for decades, and then the prospect of them being high value, but can you still access them over that time? And whether you can see that on the horizon.
So, I mean, we have a few digital collections, born digital ones, different formats where there might be an embargo or restrictions in place, and we can do that. So there's a difference between preserving the file, whether it's in network storage or in a preservation system, and just mitigating that access. And in our breakout room, we're kind of discussing that in terms of how you can be aware that there's a restriction and knowing when to then make it available, whether it's in 30, 40, 100 years. So I guess that access rights is a bit of a challenge, but that doesn't stop you from preserving and processing the collection, regardless of what it is.
Something else that's come up in the thing, and we also discussed in our breakout room, was dealing with volume. That in these born digital collections, the volume of material can be daunting. I know we are looking at a donated email collection here. The mailbox is about 60 gigabytes. There could be 300,000 or 400,000 email in the collection. And I'm not sure if you've had any thoughts about how you might deal with those just substantial increases in volume.
I think that's where a lot of these kind of command line tools come into place, where they're not going to necessarily process and solve everything, but they can at least help you with identification of personally identifiable information, duplicates, and that sort of stuff. So I mentioned RATM in my talk, which is also somewhat related to Bit Curator. So there's definitely tools out there that are available for you to run over such a large collection that can kind of help you make decisions. But then when it comes to actual redaction and providing access, they're not necessarily going to help with that side of things. But yeah, definitely automation is the key thing here. And I know from experience that importing large email collections into ePad can be tricky. So I mentioned the one I've worked with that's 11,000 emails. I had to actually, in the documentation for EPAD, it mentions how you can launch it and increase the RAM usage for the program. And so I found that it needed that increased RAM to even process that inbox. So yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because the latest version of EPAD says it can take up to 2 million email. But I've also been doing some loading of 20 or 30,000 email and finding I'm hitting problems. So yeah, I did wonder, and again, it's come up in some of the challenges people have around the staff skills that you think we need to really make progress in this. And I wondered if you could all just maybe tell us what sort of staff skills you've got or what you would be hoping to have to really get on top of this area.
I think we have a really good variety of staff skills. We have people who are really down in the kind of like hard technical skills. So that's our digital preservation technician who can kind of like write scripts for us. But we also have people who can, who know how to like install software and like, who can like, know how to work with EPAD and things like that. And we also have people who have that curatorial expertise who can make those appraisal decisions. And the thing which is interesting is that there is like, that is not one person, there's so many different kind of moving parts to it, I think. And I guess part of the collecting that we were doing with the ephemera collection was to try and kind of not necessarily need to upskill anyone super quickly, but something we did do with the staff donated emails was I ran a series of workshops for any staff who wanted to be involved on how to label their emails and export to like an inbox. And that was just like a couple of Zoom sessions. So there is some upskilling, which is like super easy to do. And then like I was available to troubleshoot for people and things like that. So yeah, I guess it's just about making sure that nobody feels like they have to have all of the skills themselves, but they know who to go to get the support they need, I think. Do you want to add?
Yeah, no, that's good. And I think for people who are kind of content specialists or understand the archival practice, it's probably good that they can just, and sometimes, say their requirements, say what they would like to have happen. And sometimes there's a way of actually doing that via a script or however. So don't be afraid, I guess, to think of your desired future state and then work towards it, rather than just waiting for someone to come to the solution for you. Yeah.
We're very strong in the curating skills, the appraisal and the liaison skills of our staff. That's a very well developed skill set within the organisation.
But we are still primarily focused on traditional archives, and we haven't really. We're still working on transitioning towards a more digital approach to archival collecting. So we are kind of limited in that sense still. It's something we are working on. As Michelle mentioned earlier, we have a handful of staff, I think, who have done the DPC Novice to Know-How training. So we're working on it.
We need to improve our skills in digital preservation because our system is at the sunset of its life. We need to also probably develop greater capacity within the organisation for scripting in Python. But we feel very positive that these things will happen. We'll just keep chipping away at it slowly and having some lovely conversations with our IT colleagues, sending them lots of papers to read, and just being very positive and future focused.
Yeah, so it's a team effort at the State Library of New South Wales as well, but basically the digital curation team, which is just me at the moment, support the entire workflow for our Born Digital collection. So really, I'm providing that quite technical support and supporting the acquisitions librarians to make those decisions about what we're getting, and then supporting our cataloging librarians, whether it's published or unpublished, to make those decisions there. So I'm not actively making any acquisition or appraisal decisions, but I'm really there to provide that technical support, whether it's the guidelines to the donors or developing technical specifications on what we should be receiving and that sort of stuff. But yeah, you definitely need a team of people. There's no kind of one person to do everything.
Thank you. And that's quite reassuring for all of us. Michelle and Simone, there's a question in the chat directed to you. If you can see that, to do with appraisal and significance of anything digital over 100 gigabytes.
Okay, so recently, I want to say it was last year, but it was possibly 2019. The State Library started a collections committee, which consists of people from the Collection Services Directorate and the Library Services Directorate, which meet to consider large collections. Basically things that are expensive or going to be time consuming or take a lot of shelf space. And so
Or digital space.
Or digital space. So the collections committee will meet to consider whether these collections are going to meet our collecting criteria, and consider whether the amount of content is, whether the content provided is going to enhance our collection to such a degree that we can invest that amount of time, resources, space, etc., to make it available to the public. At the moment, obviously, we do have backlogs. Everyone's got backlogs, and I think this is just a measure to ensure that we're not bringing in things that are just going to sit on a shelf for 40 years and we're not going to touch because we have so much other work to do.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you very much for the panel discussion. I'd just like to move on to our last topic for today. So many of you are probably familiar with Australia Preserves, which is a digital preservation community of practice for Australia and New Zealand and broader Australasian region. It's a very well structured and supported community of practice. However, the issues around email archives are broader than preservation, as we've seen today. And many of us are in the early stages of dealing with email in our collections and in our institutions. So I'd like to invite you to discuss in groups, and Larissa's going to bump you back into breakout rooms for maybe another 5 minutes, whether you're interested in a community of practice for email archives and what you'd like to see in that. So a community of practice could be as simple as a mailing list for information sharing and discussion, or it could be larger with a website. It could have regular presentations or meetups like the Australia Preserves does, or it could have other things. I've created a second Google Doc that I'm just putting into the chat now for you in your breakout rooms to capture what you think about that. And if there's enough interest from the group here today, and the Google Doc has a space for you to put your hand up to say you'd like to be involved in running that community of practice, then we'll see if we can get that established. Given the interest in today's session, I suspect that is the case, but let's see what you all think. So Larissa, if you could bump us into rooms for a quick discussion, and then we'll come back to wind up after that. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I see there's some annotation happening in the Google Doc, which is great. I think a lot of you are also very shy. So I gather in the discussions that we've had, but I'm certainly getting a sense of interest from people, which is terrific. So I'll just ask if there's anyone wanted to make any comments from the floor. If there are, put your hand up. Or turn your camera on and wave, or unmute yourself and start talking. Okay, so Amy.
Oh, it wasn't a question. I was just putting my hand up to offer some views from the breakout room I was in, which is that a mailing list would be a great place to start, and in general for the community of practice, because the email collection goes right from the point of pre-acquisition to, you know, ingest, accessibility, long-term preservation. It would be terrific to have a community of practice that everyone involved in all of those stages could benefit from and be involved in. But there was a lot of support for an email list.
Terrific. I think it's a bit meta that you have an email list to discuss managing email. At some point in the future, we'll have to archive the email list and preserve it. It is funny, actually, because I've been running an email list here in WA since 1994, and I've been using that as my body of emails to be working on EPAD. That's interesting. Anybody else? If you do, you've got access to the Google Doc, and you can probably expect to hear from me in the not too distant future. So I'd just like to conclude for today. Firstly, I'd like to again thank our speakers for their generosity of time and spirit to put themselves forward. I know that we're not all natural presenters and spruikers of our own work, but we are all very much appreciative of other people. So applause, and thank you very much for those. I'd also like to thank Larissa from the CAUL office, who's done the logistics, the registration, the Zoom wizardry, and generally making everything work. And Amy from the NSLA office for her enthusiasm and inspiration and putting me in the right direction and keeping me online and correcting me when I put the registration out without including all of the national and state libraries in the drop-down list. But thank you. It's been a fabulous collaboration. And just speaking as someone from a university library, we have so much to gain from working with the national and state libraries on lots of things, but in this area in particular. And hopefully over time we can also contribute to that. And to all of you who've come along today, thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Hope you found that very useful, and that we have a lot more opportunities in the future to have similar conversations. And I hope to visit all of you in person one day in the future. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.